reading the conclusion to Migrating to the Movies, Cinema in the Black Urban Modernity by Jacqueline Stewart. Conclusion. Oscar Micheaux's misgivings about the quality of Black urban life would reverberate in African American art and political thought with subsequent waves of Black movement. So, with the kinds of representational dilemmas he faced, migration made African American subjects visible in unprecedented ways in African American intellectual and popular discourses. But this increased visibility heightened Black and white anxieties about how Black people could or should participate in the elaboration of a modern American society and its attendant visual, mass, and public cultures. When Richard Wright was asked to write a short essay to accompany a collection of Depression-era photographs of African American life before, during, and after the migration experience, the images seemed to have swept him away. Heavily influenced by the field work of Horace Cayton and the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, and drawing on his own experience as a migrant from Mississippi, Wright produced a passionate treatise that speaks in epic and tragic terms of the working class Black migrants' quest for a better life. Wright characterized Black urban experience as, quote, death on the city pavements, end quote, referring not only to the physical demise of Black city dwellers due to disease, malnutrition, violence, and other causes, but also to the public and visible disintegration of Black character, families, and communities under the exploitative, indifferent conditions of northern urban industrialism. Moving more quickly than any other group in history from agrarian to industrial lifestyles, African Americans, Wright argues, were an, quote, utterly unprepared folk, end quote, who would necessarily suffer major casualties, quote, in the tall and sprawling centers of steel and stone, end quote. Micheaux's moralizing about urban hazards and Wright's grim portrait of the inhospitable cityscape in his account of Black migration inspired by the photographs and in his characterization of Bigger Thomas's severely circumscribed existence in Native Son, raise important questions about how we might understand the growth of Black film culture, particularly in urban areas between the world wars. To what degree did the increasing popularity of moving pictures in Black urban communities signal a new, quote, freedom, end quote, for Black cultural producers and consumers gained through migration over and against the development of unproductive new tastes for mass-produced commodities and commercialized experiences, question mark. Did the movies function as diversions from the important work of reconstituting Black lives and building counter-hegemonic social organizations and political movements in urban environments? Question mark. Did the cinema directly serve the purposes of the urban industrial complex, including its segregationist policies, by offering just enough superficial latitude for culturally specific expression, particularly at local points of exhibition, without making substantive structural or ideological changes in the ways in which films, along with other products and resources, were made, distributed, and consumed, question mark. Any consideration of the development of Black urban film culture evokes long-standing debates about the relative, quote, success, end quote, or, quote, failure, end quote, of contemporaneous Black cultural practices and types of creative expression in relation to the social and political advancements of the race. For example, Houston Baker has pointed out that the major critical accounts of the Harlem Renaissance have faulted this flowering of African American artistic production for failing to bring about any qualitative change in the lives of the Black, quote, masses, end quote. A similar argument could be made about the political efficacy of African American filmmaking and moviegoing, particularly for the largely working class Black audience. Just as the Harlem Renaissance has been accused of failing to generate a succeeding collective movement of Black artistic and literary activity, the race film movement has been faulted for its inability to build a stable institutional framework for subsequent Black filmmakers. The Great Depression dealt crushing blows to both movements, and in both cases it would seem that the gaps between Black artists and Black audiences, between Black creativity and white-controlled capital, cultural and monetary, proved extremely difficult to bridge for a sustained period of time. Many of the grave social and political problems that race film and the Harlem Renaissance seemingly, quote, failed, end quote, to address were the direct result of Black urban migration. Black movements into urban centers had cataclysmic repercussions, perhaps illustrated most dramatically by the racial violence that erupted throughout the country during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Race riots in New York City, 1900, Springfield, Ohio, 1904, and Springfield, Illinois, 1908, clearly demonstrated that America's race problem was not limited to the South. Indeed, interracial antagonisms in the North were heightened by an incendiary combination of ethnic, labor, and political tensions exacerbated by Black urban migration. William Tuttle explains that the particularly bloody riot that took place in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917 during the height of the Great Migration was, quote, fueled by bigoted and alarmist trade unionist, self-centered corporate managers, strike-breaking Black migrants from the South, corrupt white politicians, inflammatory news reporters, and biased and lax police officials, end quote. Clashes between Blacks and whites reached a dramatic peak in 1919 when riots broke out in 25 cities and towns across the country between April and October. Half of these occurred in northern and border states, including the infamous 5-day riot in Chicago that took place in July. While these events forever disabused African Americans of the notion that the urban North was an unequivocal, quote, promised land, end quote, Northern white racism did not stop the flow of Black migration or the expression of a, quote, new Negro, end quote, assertiveness. Indeed, Claude McKay's poem, quote, If We Must Die, end quote, and Oscar Micheaux's film, Within Our Gates, staples of the Harlem Renaissance and race film canons, were militant statements inspired by the events of the Red Summer of 1919. The 1919 riots, particularly the one in Chicago, were notable for the degree to which African Americans fought back, refusing to passively accept racist assaults. They marked a point of no return in U.S. race relations, though blacks would continue to be perceived as a, quote, social problem, end quote, and face numerous forms of discrimination in the future. They made it clear that they had come to the urban North to stay. In different ways, the Harlem Renaissance and early black film culture reiterated this claim. Race film production reached its height during the early 1920s, demonstrating that the steady flow of urban migration continued to invigorate the development of black film culture despite violent white efforts to repress African American participation in most arenas of American public life. Then, after the setbacks of the Depression and the introduction of expensive sound technology during the late 1920s and the early 1930s, race film production rose again in the late 1930s as segregated black audiences across the country were targeted by producers, mostly white, and black cast musicals, thrillers, comedies, and westerns. After World War II, race filmmaking crumbled for the last time as production costs soared as Hollywood studios began to incorporate black stars and themes under pressure from civil rights groups like the NAACP, and as integration became the popularized goal of U.S. race relations. When mainstream, first-run theaters became more accessible to black audiences, the segregated market for race films dwindled. African Americans still patronized neighborhood theaters and voiced their opposition to films they found to be offensive after the race film era. But black film culture took different forms as the migration slowed and television, home viewing, replaced the movie's public consumption as the predominant medium of American entertainment. Through all these shifts, one consistent feature of black film culture in the decades since the race film era has been its strong identification with urban experience in terms of both content and audience. For example, Paula Massoud has shown that during the 1930s, African American audiences craved images of modern black sophistication and, quote, genre films like Ralph Cooper's Dark Manhattan, 1937, obliged by conjoining the urban and the urbane, often through the use of contemporary fashions, not work clothes, urban slang, not rural dialect, and the performance of contemporary music, not spirituals, end quote. A few decades later, most of the action films of the, quote, blaxploitation, end quote, period were set in cities and marketed to the black urban audiences who patronized downtown theaters abandoned by whites who had fled to the suburbs. Independent filmmakers like Halle Garima and Charles Burnett of the, quote, LA Rebellion, end quote, group of black independent directors explored post-civil rights era urban disillusionment in films like Bush Mama, 1976, and Killer of Sheep, 1977. Spike Lee burst onto the scene with She's Gotta Have It, 1986, a film about and addressing a, quote, buppy, end quote, black urban professional culture that had been overlooked by Hollywood and previous black independents. 3 years later, Lee's Do the Right Thing, 1989, presented the racial antagonism seething within a diverse Brooklyn neighborhood, generating massive media attention and a wave of widely released Black urban films. These included a cycle of nihilistic, quote, boys in the hood, end quote, or, quote, ghetto action, end quote, films in the early 1990s, in which young Black men come of age in urban jungles of violence and crime. Since the early 1990s, quote, Black film, end quote, production has been booming as a steady stream of films by and about African Americans are being made independently and in Hollywood for theatrical release. Cable television, broadcast, and direct-to-video markets typically taking up urban themes. On the exhibition front, new theaters have been constructed in Black urban communities abandoned by the industry decades ago, such as the Magic Johnson Theaters in the Baldwin Hills section of Los Angeles and 125th Street in Harlem, and the inner city entertainment chain on the south and west sides of Chicago. Black-oriented film festivals proliferate in urban centers across the country, such as New York City's annual Urban World Film Festival, which presents the latest short and feature-length work to Black, Latino, and Asian American audiences, and to industry representatives seeking to exploit, quote, minority, end quote, markets. On the internet, sites such as urbanentertainment.com and urbanfilmpremiere.com showcase African American and urban-themed, end quote, films, including independent shorts, animation, and discussions of current major studio releases. As these titles suggest, urban experience continues to be fetishized in the representation of Black life and prioritized in the marketing of, quote, Black, end quote, films. But they also suggest how the entertainment industry, its dominant and independent strands, now expands the notion of the urban from its roots in Black content/audience to include broader multiracial demographics. The appeals that many recent films and marketing strategies make to a Black viewing public bear an important relation to early Black urban film culture in that they target an African American niche market like the one William Foster, Noble, and George Johnson and Oscar Micheaux attempted to exploit. However, the current phenomenon of a separate Black marketplace is not the result of the exact same kind of hostile enforcement of segregation in movie theaters witnessed in the first half of the 20th century. Instead, now there is an African American market that seems, in many respects, to choose to consume media produced specifically with Blacks in mind. The contemporary conflation of, quote, Black, end quote, and, quote, urban, end quote, while supporting a host of troubling stereotypes about African American taste and the translatability of Black identity, functions to designate storylines and markets for films and related products like soundtracks and clothing that have proved to be extremely profitable and to have significant crossover appeal. The, quote, urban, end quote, market now marks consumers of many cultural backgrounds and income brackets, particularly consumers of hip-hop culture and those who have begun the latest migration from the suburbs back to the city centers. Of course, many films produced from the race film era to the present have treated Black life beyond the city, and vibrant Black film cultures have developed outside of the urban North. Research into those areas of the South where segregated exhibition persisted much longer than in the northern cities like Chicago offers important counterpoints to the history this book has described. My efforts to trace the factors shaping the development of Black film culture in the urban North do not seek to displace these other film practices. Rather, I hope that my discussion of the origins of African American film culture offers new ways to think about how the first major waves of Black northern and urban migration reorganized America's social relations and media institutions, influencing the ways in which Black populations would experience the cinema in other local contexts and in the years to come. We know that the urban North was not the land of milk and honey that some migrants may have anticipated, and certainly many Black urban engagements with the cinema cannot be described as pleasurable or empowering. If we understand the founding relationships between African Americans, the city, and the cinema to be multiple and mutual ones, we can recover migration narratives that do not necessarily follow a straight path toward either empowerment or disillusionment. I have attempted here to describe and connect the web of feels offered uniquely by the cinema, representational and experiential, psychic and public, individual and collective, in which moving pictures and Black people in motion continue to encounter and interpret each other. And I was reading the conclusion to Migrating to the Movies, Cinema, and Black Urban Modernity by Jacqueline Najuma Stewart.